Yes, hello. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Ross Montgomery. I'm an author. This is my flat where I live. I do all my writing behind that door there, but I just won't let you see it. Just won't do it. Yeah, I thought I'd start today. Before I explain in sort of greater depth what we're going to do, I thought it would be nice to give you a bit of sense of a background of what I do, how I came to do it, that sort of thing. As mentioned, I'm a kids author. I've currently published about 26 different books across 5 different publishers, and that's been over the last 10 years. My very first book is this one that you can just see in the top left corner. Hopefully, there we go. Yeah, which is called Alex the Dog and the Unopenable Door. That came out in 2013. And I would say that the main books that I'm known for in the UK are probably this top row up at the top. That'll be when I'm writing for age 8 to 12, something like that. We call them middle grade books, and they'll generally be sort of fantasy adventures with a lot of magic and jokes and things like that. But I've also written loads of different kinds of books for different age ranges. So down at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a selection of picture books that I've written. I don't do any of the illustration. I'm really bad at drawing, just, like doing it, but rubbish. So I've done loads of different picture books with different illustrators, and I do short chapter books as well, including the ones that I'm going to be talking to you mainly about today. These ones in the bottom right, my Shake Up Shakespeare series. I also do lots of work as a children's author going into schools all around the country, all around the world, and I'll be promoting reading for pleasure, doing creative writing workshops, talking to children about their own writing. I've done at the moment about, I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's over 600 school visits in the last years. And one of the main reasons for that is because I have a teaching background. It's one of the nice things about doing my job is that actually having a background in primary school teaching, so I was teaching from nursery up until about sort of age 12, means that I can go into schools and I'm used to the chaos. It means that I can go into what I think is going to be a single creative writing workshop with 30 kids and find out I've got to lead an hour-long assembly session with 400 of them. I don't even blink because that's what being a teacher teaches you to do. I taught at one primary school for about 8 years, from being a teaching assistant and then doing my teacher training placement there. And I think that this has given me quite a useful perspective as a children's author, because I understand to some extent things that a teacher is going to need in the classroom when it comes to creative writing. And there's a reason why I wrote the books I'm going to be talking about today. One of those reasons is because I've noticed there's a real hunger from teachers for finding a suitable whole class text. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is that I think that a lot of teachers will want to cover a book, maybe reading a few minutes per day, maybe a chapter per day, but that actually an awful lot of kids' books are slightly too long to do that. You'll maybe want to tie it into a unit of work over a half term, something like that. Maybe in a half term, you'll be learning about a particular period of history. And so you'll want to do a whole class fiction book, then ties into that. But actually, for a lot of books that are maybe 60, 70,000 words long is often quite common from maybe age 8 to 12. Trying to finish that book in time becomes increasingly hard. It's also difficult to find a book that all of the children in that class are going to be able to access, that they're going to find interesting, exciting. One of the things that I always encourage when I talk to teachers about thinking about whole class texts is an awful lot of them don't know about the publisher Barrington Stoke, who are the ones who published the Shake Up Shakespeare book that I'm going to be talking to you about later. They're not paying me to do this. This is something that I genuinely think they're fantastic. The publisher Barrington Stoke really, it started to provide children with dyslexia-friendly titles. So all of the writing will be in a very simple, accessible language. They're written in a certain way. They're presented in a certain way that means it's easier for children for dyslexia to read them. But I don't think that's all they're good for. What Barrington Stoke books really are incredibly accessible texts. And that means if you read one out to a class, the chances of everyone being able to access them in the same way are there. The other thing that they're really good for is the fact that they are incredibly short. These are basically novellas for children. They're about 5,000 to 8,000 words long. And that means that you can read them in a half-term topic. It means that you're not racing every single day to try and get through as much as possible to get the book done. They're written by pre-existing authors, and the quality of them is just fantastic. They also work across all age ranges. So they have a Little Gems range, which is for age 3, 4, 5, something like that. They'll also do a sort of middle grade range, but then they even go into secondary as well. So you can get fantastic young adult titles that are similar short books. I just think they're brilliant. I really feel they should be a mainstay of every classroom. It's one of the reasons that I recommend them. But the other thing that I was thinking about when I wrote this series of books that I'm going to be focusing on today, the Shake Up Shakespeare series, is I realized there's also a hunger with teachers in primary school to cover Shakespeare. And that's actually a very difficult thing to do. I mean, if you try and teach Shakespeare to children that are maybe age 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, you're kind of coming up against quite a few obstacles. One of them is the language, which is difficult. It means that you have to spend a lot of time trying to teach children even just what characters are saying, let alone what's going on. And then you get to the second issue with Shakespeare plays, which is the plots are often really complicated. They often refer to stuff that you need to have actually some historical understanding to get. I mean, also a lot of them rely on understanding British culture, which like not all children are going to have. So what I realized was there's really, for primary school children, about 4 different Shakespeare plays that you can realistically cover that are plot driven, that are easy to understand, that have sort of suitable content that aren't going to alienate or confuse children. Those 4 titles are A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Tempest, Macbeth, and Romeo and Juliet. Those are really only the 4 that you can teach to children aged 7, 8, 9, 10. The others just don't really work. And so what I decided to do was that there was a gap to kind of fulfill both of these things, where I could be writing short versions of those 4 Shakespeare plays and do them with Barrington Stoke in this easily accessible, fun way. That's what ended up becoming my Shake Up Shakespeare series. The idea was I wanted to make these stories fun, instantly accessible, and a little bit different, because you can find versions of Shakespeare stories that are written for a child audience. So they will be abridged, they'll be much shorter, they'll simplify the language. The thing that I felt is that I've never really found any that are that good. They can often make it quite boring, and you end up losing the whole point of those stories, which is they're meant to grab you and they're meant to be exciting. They're meant to get children excited about Shakespeare. What I decided to do, rather than telling the stories completely straight, rather than just making them a direct adaptation, is I wanted to do something a little bit more playful. I wanted to adapt the stories, but change them into something almost completely different. What I did with each of these books is I took a Shakespeare play, I set it in a primary school that I've invented called New Forest Academy, and then I wanted each book to focus on a different child in that school. And each story at the heart of it is something in that school going wrong, which I think all children will be able to relate to and they will find funny as well. So Rock Bottom is based on A Midsummer Night's Dream, but that's about a school play that goes wrong. Tripwrecked is based on The Tempest, that's about a school trip that goes wrong. Hurly Burly is based on Macbeth, but it's about a prize-giving assembly that goes wrong. And Fortune's Fools, the last one in the series, is based on Romeo and Juliet, but it's a sports day. And really what I think this is an opportunity to do with children is to talk about adaptations. What I'm doing with these books is I'm taking all of the ingredients in those Shakespeare plays, discarding some of them, and then trying to make a new story with what's left. So Rock Bottom, the first book in the series, is based on A Midsummer Night's Dream, but I'm kind of focusing on mistaken identity and people falling in love with each other and stuff going wrong. It's not necessarily featuring things like fairies and donkeys and stuff like that. I'm kind of taking what I want and I'm making a brand new story from it. It's the same with Tripwrecked. It's based on The Tempest, but what I'm doing is I'm setting it on a school trip that goes horribly wrong. The ferry leaves the port, immediately gets hit by a storm and capsizes. And when this drama class wake up, they're stuck on a desert island with no adults. And they begin to realize that there are some weird, eerie similarities between what they're experiencing and The Tempest, the play that they've been studying. The third book in the series, Hurly Burly. I mean, I think Macbeth is a particularly brilliant Shakespeare play to do with primary children. It's out of all of the plots of Shakespeare plays, it is the easiest to follow. It's the one that makes the most sense. It's not necessarily jumping from different characters all over the place. It is gory and it is gruesome and it is scary. So what I thought I'd do is I'd take this sort of scary play and I would make it about a really well-behaved girl called Beth, Macbeth. you see. Beth is the best behaved girl in school. She's so well behaved that she's actually won the best behavior award that they have at the end of each year, 2 years in a row. If she wins it for 3 years in a row, it's going to be the school record. No one's ever beaten that. But then Beth discovers that she hasn't won the best behavior award this year. She hasn't even come in second place. She's third. And Beth is so angry, she decides she doesn't want to be well behaved anymore. She wants to be very, very badly behaved, to frame the children who came in first and second place so that she can then make it look as if they've broken the rules. It means that she will then be able to get the best behavior award. And just like Macbeth, it all goes horribly, horribly wrong. The last book in the series, Fortune's Fools, I wanted to do a story that was based on Romeo and Juliet, but I realized that I thought the problem with teaching that play at primary age is that they're just not interested in romance. They just find it gross and uninteresting. And I thought, okay, well, I don't have to make it as a direct love romance. I decided that I was going to make it about two best friends, Blake and Dom, who feature in some of the other books. They are absolute bestest best friends. They always have to sit next to each other in every lesson. They always have the same lunch. They go to each other's houses at the end of the day every day. They're obsessed with each other. But then they find out that at sports day, they're going to have to compete against each other. They're best friends, but they're being turned into rivals. When I go into schools and I talk about to children about these books and I talk to them about creative writing, this is something that I focus on, which is that it's kind of a loose adaptation. I'm using those plays as a starting off point, but then I can tell my own stories within them. There aren't really any rules. I can change the bits that I want. I can keep some bits that I do like. There are really no rules. And I think this is actually a really great way of getting children doing creative writing. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you almost like a potted short version of what I will normally end up doing during a session when I go into school. I'll explain, I'll do a bit of a reading. I'll explain how I then take that and I get them thinking about their own writing. And this is maybe something that you can use in your class as well. In order to do that, I will be starting with a reading, because how could I not? It's the best thing. The nice thing about these books is you can read them in any order. You don't have to read, 1, 2, and 3 in order to read the fourth one, Fortune's Fools. You can pick up each one depending on whatever play it is that you're doing, maybe within your school. But for today, I'm going to start with book 1, Rock Bottom. I'm going to start with chapter 1, page 1. And the name of that chapter is Nick Loves Jessie. I doodled Jessie's name on my hand in biro, and then I drew love hearts and flowers all around it. I'd written it on my arms too, and down both of my legs. I was getting really good at it. Oh, Jessie, I said with a sigh, love of my life, light of my soul, Nick. I looked up. My best friend, Frank, was staring at me and prodding me with his elbow and shaking his head, as usual. Nick, he said, do you have to do that? People are looking at us. Frank was right. Everyone on the bus to school was staring at me, including the driver. I could hear cars honking behind us. Stare all you want, I cried, leaping up and waving my inky arms. I love Jessie Stone, and I don't care who knows it. It was true. I had been in love with Jessie Stone ever since the first day she'd walked into my classroom, looked me in the eye, and asked me to get out of her way. Ever since that first precious moment, my feelings had just grown stronger and stronger. Jessie was clever. She was popular. She was the best actor our school had ever seen. It was our destiny to fall in love, get married, say our vows on top of a mountain somewhere. Nick, sit down, Frank cried as he dragged me back to my chair. Ah, why do you always have to be so over the top? That is Frank all over. We've been best friends since nursery, but he's never understood my sensitive, passionate side. He was always trying to stop me doing totally normal things like writing Jessie epic love poems, or spelling out her name in chocolates on her desk, or filling her front garden with 1,000 red roses. There's nothing wrong with being romantic, I said. You're not being romantic, you're being creepy, said Frank. You don't know anything about Jessie. You never even talk to her. That's not true. We talk every single day. Ah, She has to talk to you, Nick. You're the lunch monitor. I sighed. She gave me her tray yesterday. Her tray. And I'll never forget what she said when she gave it to me. Put this in the bin, Rick. Can you believe that? She knows my name. Sort of. She almost knows my name. She's like one letter away, and then she'll know my name. Frank's glasses steamed up. That always happens when he gets annoyed. Nick, wake up. It's never going to happen. Jessie doesn't know you exist, and everyone knows she likes Blake. Surprise is there. Everyone likes Blake. He was the coolest kid in school, with great hair and fantastic clothes. He never said or did anything interesting, but people still thought he was amazing. He could stand up in assembly and wet himself, and everybody would say, "Oh, nice one, Blake," or "Oh, great wee, Blake," or "Why don't you come around my house this weekend and wet yourself there, Blake?" And even if Jessie didn't like Blake, said Frank, "She's leaving at the end of term, remember?" "Of course I remember," I shouted. Everybody turned to stare at me again, and Frank was so embarrassed he hid behind his bag. I couldn't help shouting. Jessie was leaving at the end of term to go to drama school, and it hurt. The pain was still so deep and so raw. In fewer than 2 months, the love of my life would be gone forever. "Face it, Nick, it's over," said Frank. You have to forget about her." I shook my head. How could I forget about Jessie? I'd cried for 5 whole days when I found out that she was leaving, and so had our drama teacher, Miss Plant. After all, New Forest Academy, our school, was going to be losing its best actor. Jessie had had the main part in every single school play since she'd joined, and this term's production of William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream was going to be her final performance. Which is how I'd come up with the greatest idea of my life. I clapped my hand on Frank's back and grinned. "That's where you're wrong, Frank. As it so happens, I've been working on a secret plan to win Jessie's heart. A plan so brilliant it cannot fail." The bus pulled up to the stop and I jumped out of my seat and ran through the school gates. Frank ran after me. "Secret plan? What secret plan?" "Oh, Nick, what have you done?" I smiled. The plan had only come to me last week, but it was genius. Do you remember last week when I got you to audition for the school play with me? Right. Pause the story for a moment. Eyes on the screen. This is where I explained to the kids in the session about the school play that they're putting on, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Right. William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream is all about people falling in love with each other. Helena loves a boy called Demetrius, but he's set to get married to her best friend, Hermia. Hermia doesn't even want to marry Demetrius because in secret, she's in love with another boy called Lysander. It's all very complicated. They all run into a forest and fall asleep. And that's when things get really complicated. Because a naughty fairy called Puck tries to help them out, and he uses magic to make Demetrius fall in love with Helena. But Puck gets the 2 boys mixed up. So instead of Demetrius falling in love with Helena, Lysander falls in love with her. And that makes Hermia mad, so Puck has to try and fix things, right? But Puck ends up making Demetrius falling in love with Helena too by accident. And that makes Hermia so angry. Because remember, Lysander is already racing after, crazy with love. Hermia is so angry that she and Helena end up fighting. I told her it was complicated. Luckily, at the end, it all gets sorted. All of the couples end up matched up as they're supposed to be, and they celebrate by going to a big wedding that's being held in town. I mean, there are other characters as well, right? It's not just these guys. There's loads of characters. Like an idiot named Bottom who Puck turns into a donkey for a joke. He's not important. Don't look at him. Don't look at him. He's not important. He's just some stupid actor who puts on a terrible play with his friends, and it's so bad that everybody at the wedding ends up laughing at them. I didn't care about joke characters like this. No, don't look at him. Stop looking at him. Stop it. I didn't care about joke characters like that. What I cared about were the main romantic boy roles. Jessie was bound to get cast as one of the main girls, Hermia or Helen. If I could get cast as one of the main boys, Demetrius or Lysander, I'd get weeks of rehearsing love scenes with. I would impress her with my acting skills. Jessie would realize that we're a perfect match. She'd fall head over heels in love with me. She'd forget all about leaving school. And then we could go and get married on top of a mountain somewhere. It was simple. By the time I'd finished explaining my plan to Frank, his glasses were so steamed up they looked like they'd been painted. Nick? That's the stupidest plan I've ever heard! Jeffrey's not going to fall in love with you just because you're a good actor! I shook my head again. Wrong again, Frank. This is my chance to show her my sensitive romantic side. I'm sick of her treating me like I'm a big joke while guys like Blake get all the attention. It's time for my turn in the spotlight. I grabbed his hand. Quick! This plant's going to put up the cast list outside the drama studio. Let's see which part she gave me. Frank groaned. Oh, okay, but if it doesn't work, promise me you won't get upset and start wailing again. Frank didn't need to worry. I had aced my audition, saying my lines as loudly as I could, waving my hands a lot, and crying real tears with snot and everything. Miss Plant said she had the perfect part. That had to mean I was Demetrius or Lysander. Sure. Oh, no, don't look at it. Don't look at it. Don't look at it. No, go away. Go away. There we go. Sure enough, the cast list was up outside the drama studio. I elbowed everybody aside to try and work out which parts everyone would be given. Right. Ruby is Hermia. Jessie is Helena. Gasp. Jessie was Helena. That was perfect. She had romantic scenes with Demetrius and Lysander. I looked down to see which of the boys had been cast as. Blake is Demetrius. Dom is Lysander. I blinked. Wait, what's going on? Where's my name? Frank gulped. It's down there. I looked down the list. Right down. There was my name, all right. But it wasn't next to the part that I was expecting. Nick. Bottom. But no! 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 Yes, bottom. Nick wanted to get cast as one of the main romantic board roles in the Midsummer Night's Dream, so he could win Jessie's heart, and instead he ended up being cast as a character who spends almost their entire time in the play turned into a donkey for a. He's going to look like a complete idiot, and his plan to win Jessie's heart is in tatters. And so he comes up with another plan, an even better plan. A plan to sabotage the school play on opening night, so that at the very last minute he could take Blake's role of Demetrius and go out on stage and impress Jessie with his acting skills and win Jessie's heart, and she'll fall head over heels in love with him, get all about leaving school, and it goes brilliantly. It doesn't. It all goes horribly wrong. And at this point, I normally tell the children, I'm not going to tell you exactly how it goes wrong. You're going to have to read it to find out. Now, hopefully you've seen that what I've done with this book is I've taken A Midsummer Night's Dream, but I've kind of turned it into just a silly, jokey story about school, which I think is a really good way to get children interested. And a lot of the ingredients from A Midsummer Night's Dream are here, but they're kind of twisted and turned around into something new. And I talk a lot about this to children, and I say that this is called an adaptation, and that people have been doing this with stories for ages. People take other people's stories and they tell their own version. I explain that in the Shake Up Shakespeare series, really, I've stolen all of the ideas for this book from this guy, and I ask them who that is, and they tell me William Shakespeare, and I say, yes, I know, I wrote his name on his forehead. I remind them that William Shakespeare is most well known for his plays. He wrote 40 of them. He lived between 1564 and 1616. So those plays are hundreds of years old, but they're still being performed all over the world. And I think the main reason for that is because the stories of William Shakespeare plays are great. They've been so popular and so beloved for so many years that people have been taking his plays and making new stories out. So I give them a few examples. I tell them about the story of Hamlet, about the Prince of Denmark, who discovers that his father, the king, has been murdered by his evil uncle, and so he has to get thrown out of Denmark, and then he comes back to get his revenge. And I tell them, does that story sound familiar to you? Because there's a famous adaptation of Hamlet. It was turned into a cartoon, a Disney cartoon, and somebody will always guess it. It's The Lion King. Simba is the prince of the lions. His father, Mustafa, the king, is murdered by evil Uncle Scar. Simba has to leave from his kingdom, and then he meets Timon and Pumbaa. That's kind of the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern character. It's an adaptation of Hamlet, but most people, and obviously almost all children, don't know that. And I think that's a brilliant way to get them thinking about how you can take a story that already exists and just tweak it and turn it into something else. This isn't a story about humans, it's about animals. And you can do that with adaptations. You can take a story and make it about robots and aliens. There are no rules. The next example I always give is Romeo and Juliet. And at this point, they always groan because they don't like hearing about romantic plays. They're not interested in it. But I say this story has been adapted loads and loads and loads of times. I ask them if they can think about maybe a film that this is based on. I get them thinking about the title, Romeo and Juliet. And eventually somebody will guess, oh, of course, there's the film Nomeo and Juliet, which I think at the moment is on Netflix. It is, at least in the UK. Yeah, they take that Romeo and Juliet story, the Montagues versus the Capulets, but they're one of each falling in love, and they make it about garden gnomes. You have the gnomes in the garden, the gnomes in the house. They hate each other, but then a garden gnome and a house gnome fall in love. If you're doing this with older children, I would say sort of age 7, 8, 9, they haven't heard of West Side Story, the musical, but older children often have, especially with that recent Steven Spielberg film. Again, they take the Romeo and Juliet story, two families who don't like each other, but they make it about street gangs. They set it in New York in the 1950s, and they add songs to it as well. You have two gangs, the Sharks and the Jets, who are always fighting because they're street gangs, but then one night a shark and a jet fall in love. Those are the same story. One person took Romeo and Juliet and they made it a silly film about gnomes. And then they also took the same story and somebody else turned it into a musical about street gangs. But there's even more. If you go younger, you can get take the author Julia Donaldson, who wrote the book The Gruffalo. She did her own adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, which was the Smeds and the Smooths. She makes hers about aliens. You've got the Smeds who are red, the Smooths who are blue. They don't like each other, but then a Smed and a Smooth fall in love. And I say to the children, do you not see the difference this makes? All of these are from the same story. One's about gnomes, one's about street gangs. Julia Donaldson turned it into a picture book that's about aliens. And when I did it, I turned it into a story about two best friends who have to compete against each other on sports day. All that matters when you do an adaptation is that you make it about something that you find interesting. You think about what you would want to write about, because then your enthusiasm for that subject is going to come through. But apart from that, there are no rules. What I then tell the children is that we are going to do our own version of it. We are going to make an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, the greatest love story ever told, but we're going to make it about something completely different. And at this point, they groan because they don't want to do a love story. They're like, no, it's boring. But I tell them, we don't have to make it a love story. What we need to do is we need to think about what is at the very center of that Romeo and Juliet story. And that is, you have two things that don't like each other, but then one of each end up falling in love. So you could do, if you like animals, cats and dogs, right? Cats and dogs don't like each other, always fighting. What if a cat and a dog fell in love? But there are no rules. You can make it weird. You can make this story about ice cream. You could set it on an ice cream planet where ice cream is alive and walks and talks. And maybe on this planet, raspberry ripple ice cream and chocolate fudge brownie ice cream hate each other. They're always fighting with flakes as spears or something. But then a raspberry ripple ice cream and a chocolate fudge brownie ice cream fall in love. I asked them first of all to think about, well, what would you write about? If you were telling this story and you were taking two things that don't like each other, what do you find interesting? Would you make it about history? Would you make it about maybe the Romans versus the Vikings? Do you like the Marvel films? Would you maybe do it about superheroes instead? I want them thinking about the characters, but also the setting where the story would take place. Now, there are no rules for that. If they want to write about ice cream flavors, but they want to set it in their school that they go to, they can do that, right? But I do tell them that the setting that they choose, they might realize later on, is kind of affecting the plot. And I tell them that there are things that they might later on want to change. I talk to them a lot about the fact that when they're coming up with ideas for their stories, a lot of children want to try and get it perfect first time. They write it in one go. But I talk to them a lot about how this is not how stories work. I rewrote Rock Bottom about 6 times. It took me about 8 months to do it. And actually, the changes that you make can often be the best part of those stories. What I then do is I get them going through the sort of basic idea of what happens in Romeo and Juliet step by step. And we think about what we could do with our adaptation. So in Verona, two families, the Montagues and the Capulets, are constantly fighting. So I say to them, all right, well, we need to work out where our story is set. Romeo and Juliet's in the city of Verona. Where would your story be? But also think about what your family names could be. Now, you could call them the Montagues and the Capulets. I mean, I did this version once with a kid who did pizzas and pineapples, right? Pizzas and pineapples hate each other. And I said, yeah, you call them the Montagues and the Capulets, you call them the pizza and the pineapples, but let's try and come up with like an interesting family name for each of them. And loads of suggestions went around. Someone eventually said, why don't you call it the Juicies and the Greasies, right? Because pineapples are juicy, pizzas are greasy. And everybody went, oh yeah, that's kind of clever. It rhymes, so they feel similar, but they're different as well. So that, yeah, brilliant. All right, so we had our family names. Next step. Romeo is a young Montague. Juliet is a young Capulet who's about to get married. Now, I'll stick with the pizza and the pineapple story, right? I was like, okay, well, we have to decide what we're going to call our two main characters. We could call them Romeo and Juliet if we want. We'll just use the same names. You call them anything, Bob and Bobette. You can call them pizza and pineapple. But again, I said, let's try and come up with some good names. And this is an example of where changing stuff can make it interesting. Originally, when we did the pizza and the pineapple, the pizza was the Romeo character. I think they called it like Pizio or something. And the pineapple was the Juliet character. And then about halfway through the story, someone went, no, swap them round. Because if you make the pizza the Juliet character, you could call her Margarita. And the kids were like, oh my God. It's a name, but it's also a pizza, right? So like, that's an example of you can make a change and it improves your story. To let you know, what I'm normally doing at this point during the session is I have like a big flip chart with. I've taken down a list of their ideas in bullet points, and we'll choose one just for the session. Let's say we're doing the pizza and pineapple. And I will just start drawing it. I'll draw a pizza and a pineapple, give them a face, arms, legs, do little love hearts to show they're in love. We'll have picked where the setting is, so I'll draw that in the background. And I'm kind of accumulating almost like a drawing in front of me, right? Just to sort of help bring it to life and show them that's what it looks like. Next step of the story. Now, in the play, Romeo sneaks into a Capulet ball, so like a costume party. He has to wear a disguise because obviously a Montague isn't going to be allowed into a Capulet party. So he disguises himself, goes inside. That's when he sees Juliet. This is her party to celebrate her wedding. He sees her, and the moment he sees her, he falls instantly head over heels in love. She falls in love with him. Boom, it's happened. At this point, I say to the children, we need to somehow find a way of disguising a pineapple so it looks like a pizza, so it can sneak into a pizza party. And the kids get so excited about this. They try and come up with all these different ideas. How can you disguise a pineapple to look like a pizza? The cleverest idea anyone's ever come up with was what was it? The story that we were doing was ketchup and mayonnaise. It all took place in a fridge. And we were like, oh, how do you get ketchup into a mayonnaise party? And we came up with all these different ideas. And then one kid went, no. All you have to do is the ketchup walks up to the mayonnaise party, and the mayonnaise is like, hey, you can't come in here. You're a ketchup. And the ketchup says, no, I'm not. I'm mayonnaise wearing a ketchup costume. Amazing idea. I mean, it's why I like doing creative writing sessions with kids, is they come up with stuff I never would have come up with. I think that's absolutely genius. The last point that we do is I say, Juliet falls in love with him. She's horrified, right? Because she's meant to be married to somebody else. So she runs out of the party. Romeo goes into the garden, stands beneath her balcony. He professes his love for her. She comes out onto the balcony and she says, oh, I love you too. Oh. It's the most romantic moment in the history of theatre, the Romeo and Juliet balcony scene. We're going to do it with a pizza and a pineapple. But at this point, I say, well, we have to think about this famous scene. The balcony scene, we've got to have, the Romeo character down low. We've got to have the Capulet character up high. How is that going to work in our story? And this is where we start thinking about their setting. Because if they've decided to set their story in the school, they might go, oh, yeah, well, maybe one of them could be up in the basketball hoop and the other one's down there. Maybe there's a balcony of your playground, so you could use that. But this is the point where I say, if you can't find a solution in your story, you might want to change the setting. You might want to, instead of setting it in your school, set it on another planet, and that gives you a whole different range of ideas. But by this point, on that flip chart I've been doing, adding different details, what I've effectively done is I've created a poster for that story. So I say to them, like, all right, well, if you were going to make this for your own story, because your one might not be about a pizza and a pineapple, yours might be about robots and aliens, or dolphins and sharks, or people that you know. If you were going to design a poster for it, how would it look? And that's kind of great because you're linking that already to art, you're linking it to English and creative writing. You're kind of already fulfilling lots of different parts of your curriculum just in that one task. And I also think that often when I teach creative writing, I always start by getting them to draw. Because even if they don't enjoy drawing and it's not something that they're particularly strong at, it is easier for them to get their ideas down and kind of start solidifying them as a drawing than it is for them to start writing it down as sentences that kind of make sense. And the one and only reason for that is because they've got a jump start of drawing because they were able to draw for a few years before they were writing. That is how I often do it during the session. I will then leave the kids, they will draw their own poster, and then we get a chance to share each other's ideas of thinking like, okay, well, what's going to happen in your story? Have you changed anything? What have you adapted? And the nice thing with doing these kind of loose adaptations is that it gives children a framework for their own stories. They don't have to come up with everything from scratch. They can take a story that already exists and then they get to kind of play around within it. They use it as a sandbox. If in their version of Romeo and Juliet, they want to give it a happy ending, maybe the two lovers don't die at the end, maybe at the end of their story, the families make up and the couple end up like helping them do that. If they want to have a happy ending, they can. If they want to completely do away with huge parts of the plot and turn it into their own story, that's great. They're allowed to do it. But it sort of gives them a little bit of almost like training wheels to get that working, almost like when you start riding a bike. So I think it could be a really, really useful way to introduce creative writing, as well as linking it to one of these plays that you might already be learning. All right, I've gone a little bit over from what I was planning. I was talking too much, but that's hopefully giving you an idea of how I tend to cover these books in class and give you a little bit of idea of the series as well. So I'm wondering, Bethan, that's probably a good time for us to do maybe some questions for the Q&A. Tell you what, if I stop sharing that, then take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Ross. That was fantastic. I think everyone else on the call could say the same thing as well. I know the chat box has been really active and we've got lots of emojis flying around everywhere as well. So it's great to see. Thank you, everyone.
I think I saw somebody saying that I look like a young Jerry Lewis, which is that is a first. I've never had that, but I will take it.
I will take that. Yeah. Brilliant. So I can see as well, so I think Konstantin, so you've got your hand up, so unfortunately we can't unmute you from the mic. So if you would like to put your question in the chat box, then we will pitch this to Ross now and go that way. So I think I'm going to kick this off with a question that I asked this morning, which was a personal one, that I asked, do you have a favourite story in the series, Ross?
I always, whenever children ask me this, right, I always say, like, children will always want to know what's your favorite book that you have written. And I think it's such a mean question. I always tell them it's like asking a parent, which child is your favorite? Like, which child do you love more? They cannot answer that. That just doesn't make any sense. I will say, out of the 4 books, I think the best written one is probably Fortune's Fools, the Romeo and Juliet one. I think possibly just because it was the last one I wrote and I'd sort of made a few mistakes and learned them along the way. So I think that's the best written one, but I do have a real soft spot for Rock Bottom just because it's the very first one that I did. I actually, when I started writing it, it was a very different book. I didn't really realize that what I was doing was an adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It wasn't, I knew I wanted to write a story about this sort of hopelessly romantic boy who is in love or thinks he's in love with a girl in his class, and he tries to use the school play to win her round. But then I was thinking, like, well, what play is it going to be? And it would only be funny if it was quite like a sort of serious play. Like, it can't be like a nativity or like a silly little school play. And I realized, oh, it will be a Shakespeare play. And then I realized there's actually a bit of Midsummer Night's Dream going on here. And even within that play, there's a play within the play. And that's kind of what's going on with Rock Bottom. It's almost like a play within a play within a play. That hopefully that's almost like a discussion point for kids as well. In fact, thinking about it, something that I forgot to mention is that if any people are interested in doing these books in class, each book does come with its own sort of classroom activity pack with like resources and discussion guides, things like that. I just thought I'd mention that because I've got to do it in the last session.
Yeah, no, absolutely, which is great to accompany. You've got a fantastic lesson idea from Ross there as well. So it goes kind of hand in hand then as well for what you can be doing for creative writing for the classroom too. So yes, we'll send those around in the follow-up email for the activity packs for you to access at the end. Okay, so we've had another one here. So we've had a question about what made you want to be a writer, Ross?
I would say so. I was always one of those kids who I've always loved reading, and so I think that's always been like, that's always meant it was a little bit easier for me. I think I was one of those kids who, if you gave me a choice to do anything, I would probably choose to go and read. Um, and as a result of that, I kind of liked writing my own stories because those two will always go hand in hand. I always tell kids, if you want to be a writer, you do have to make sure you're reading all the time. You also have to make sure you're writing all the time as well, because the more you do it, the better you get at it. I think that most kids, they tend to think they want to get a story perfect in their heads and completely watertight because they think you write it once and that's it. And I tell them, like, that's not how this works. You've got to be writing because you often solve things through writing it, and you see stuff that doesn't work and does work. For me, writing stories and reading was just something that I always loved to do, and I ended up I did it all the way through school, and then I stopped when I was a teenager, which I think most people do. But I stopped reading, I stopped writing, and I kind of rediscovered it when I was 17, and it was like a light came on. I just forgot how much I loved it. That has always meant that it's quite an obvious like link for me to become a writer, but it's also not necessary. I am friends with a lot of authors who just did not enjoy reading at school. They didn't like it. They hated reading, they hated writing, and they came to it later in life and realized that they loved it, and that was sort of like their path to doing it. So it's not necessary, but it does make a difference. I always recommend, if you have reluctant readers in your class, the two things that I recommend are comics, first of all, because they are brilliant. They're so much better than they were when I was a kid. But the comics that I read, you're giving them training wheels to understanding how a story works. Even with these books, they're highly illustrated to sort of like help them comprehend that text as they're going through it. And comics are a brilliant way to do that. The other thing I always recommend is horror. Kids who don't like reading love horror, and that is almost like without any exceptions whatsoever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think if anyone wants to know a little bit more about kind of graphic novels as well, so the previous webinar to this one, we ran with two of our graphic novel authors. So if you did want to know a little bit more about that and how that can be incorporated in your classroom too, then you can watch that webinar back. If you didn't join us already, if you're not a regular of the series, you can watch that back there. That's a great way of doing it. And yeah, it's all about, those reluctant readers. How are you going to kind of get them involved as well? And it might be that there's a barrier to the reading in English, and it might be down the dyslexia route, or it could be that they're just reluctant to kind of read too. And that's where kind of Barrington Stoke can really shine through with a lot of Ross's titles that or all of Ross's titles that he's got there as well. So that is brilliant as well. And I know, I mean, I'm sure you get this question all the time, Ross, for, how did you get there to be a writer? But it's something that maybe, younger students do say, I'd like to be a writer. And that's something that we're seeing more of now for in the classrooms too, thinking about careers and then how that's mapping through subjects. And I think showing that to students as well, and the pathway that they can get there, can also help to encourage and into certain subjects in different areas as well for that particular student. So yeah, fantastic. Okay, sorry, I hijacked that one a little bit at the end of
Okay.
that. Okay, so we've had another one to say, do you have any recommendations for using the text for English as a second language classroom? So I can pick up a little bit for that one there as well for second language parts. So yeah, the texts are great. So actually Barrington Stoke do have a couple of books that are CEFR leveled, for if that's something that you would like to know more about, and that goes from A1 to B2, I believe, for those readers if you wanted those levels. For Ross's text in particular, I think they're fantastic, that they're really relatable, and that that the student can see themselves in that situation as well, and that sort of helps them with the level of understanding with the English too, and they're very highly illustrated. So it's then using kind of the pictorial elements with the language elements, and something that they are going to enjoy reading, which I think is also super important. You know, that humor, those who want humor, that would be it's a great sort of use really there as well. And then the exact kind of ideas that Ross has said and given today is fab anyway, to be honest, regardless of, you know, first language, second language. It's kind of exploring around really. So it could be that you're taking elements out more for text, exploring that a little bit more. There's lots of ways to do it, and the activity pack can be a good way for a reference that you can refer back to that too. Yeah, super. Right. Okay, so do you have any recommendations of any cross-curricular activities for the text here, Ross?
I would say, whenever I'm asked this by teachers about like cross-curricular links, it's an interesting one, because I think a huge amount of it depends on how your school works and how you tend to balance kind of subjects within your school. I think that in my experience, like those kind of cross-curricular links are always just an opportunity for like teachers' imaginations to really shine. Because I think you can usually link any text to like any subject that you want, depending on how like smart you want to be with it. So I think automatically, I mean, even if I think about, for example, were you doing Tripwrecked, which is focusing on the Tempest, there's obviously a great link there to think about history and about like naval travel, the fact that like that's a book about sailors who are trying to get from one part to another. That's a river travel. You get to look at old maps. The fact that it's taking place on an island links to geography really nicely. You could start thinking about like the formation of islands and things like maps. It already starts linking itself to art with, I guess, maybe the suggestions that I made earlier of like creating a poster. Even, I mean, breaking down your own story, or even breaking down one of these stories into a comic strip, is effectively you're working out the storytelling of it, but you're also working out how you could sort of decode that visually. It's kind of entirely just up to you and about like how your school chooses to make those links. The fact that it's already a text that's kind of based on a play, I always saw these as being like, these would be texts that would arise because a teacher wanted to focus on one of those plays, maybe in drama or in English. But then it's something that could sit alongside that, where you could think like, okay, well, we've got the fixed text and the thing that we're all acting, but then we could also think about how you could take that and just play around with it and turn it into something completely different. And I think that playing around with is all like, it's the key part of creativity.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And then we think we've got time for maybe one more question here. So we've got with all the technology of the modern world, do you have any ideas? So we've got do you have any ideas of how to inspire creative writing that is maybe away from the technology, or maybe harnessing technology, I guess?
I always think when it comes to like harnessing technology, I've often found that kids tend to be the ones who use it more readily. I think they're sort of what's the phrase that we're going to use? We say they're digital natives.
Digital natives, yeah.
So actually, if you're kind of doing everything that leads up to that already, they kind of find it themselves. And it can be something that you can explore later if you wish, because it's quite nice to be able to provide them with an opportunity to do that. I would say that storytelling is eternal. And I think that the best way that you can get kids excited about reading and writing is through storytelling. One of the things that took me a few years to become really, really comfortable with was reading aloud. Because it's a bit weird doing it. You don't normally do it. And actually, when you start doing it, you realize this is hard. Like, I'm not actually as good at this as I thought I did. And I learned from doing lots of these school visits that actually, the more I acted it and the more enthusiasm that I went with it, and the voices and gestures and things like that, you almost can't do too much. Like, the more enthusiasm I did it with, the better a reaction that I seemed to get. So I would say one of the best ways to get them excited about reading and writing is by like showing them that storytelling is really fun. I genuinely think that when kids get to about age 8 and teachers stop reading to them, and I think that is just such a lost opportunity. Like, kids who are like 13 like being read to. Like, they might not show it, they might be a bit like, but they do like being read to. And when you read a text to them, you're modeling what a narrative voice is meant to sound in their own head. You're showing them how that, like the text on a page, which can seem really dead, how it comes to life. Kind of in the same way that, like, you know, you'll have studied a Shakespeare play and there'll be like a monologue or a soliloquy. And you're like, I just don't really understand what this is. And then you watch an actor bring it to life. And suddenly it's not even just that it's being acted well, it has meaning where you didn't realize it was there. I would say storytelling and providing them with texts that are really exciting. And that can be a hindrance for a lot of teachers because they don't know about the books that are out there. But if you can find a way to sort of like actually start exploring that a little bit and finding good recommendations and doing sessions like this, the more it helps.